On April 23, 1951, John Garfield sat before Congress for 3 hours and refused to name a single name. In one of the strangest moments of the era, the same committee members interrogating him later asked for his autograph and argued over who would take him to lunch. Less than a year later, Garfield was dead. He was 39 years old, blacklisted, financially ruined, and abandoned by the industry that had once made him a star. Years later, even the FBI admitted they had no evidence that Garfield had done anything wrong. But by then, Hollywood had already destroyed him, and Garfield wasn't alone. Over the next few decades, actors, writers, directors, and musicians would find their careers erased through blacklists, morality clauses, exploitative contracts, public scandals, and institutional control. This wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was a system, a machine designed to create stars and, when necessary, destroy them. To understand how Hollywood turned against its own legends, we need to examine 3 mechanisms of control. The Hollywood blacklist didn't begin as a government order. It began as a private industry agreement. In November 1947, studio executives met at New York's Waldorf Astoria and announced they would no longer employ the Hollywood 10, writers and directors accused of communist sympathies who refused to cooperate with congressional investigations. What began as a targeted action quickly expanded. Soon, anyone suspected of communist ties, anyone who refused to testify, or anyone simply named by another person could find themselves unemployable. Then came red channels. Published in 1950, the pamphlet listed 151 actors, writers, musicians, and broadcasters allegedly connected to communist organizations. It wasn't a legal document. It didn't need to be. For many employers, simply appearing in its pages was enough to end a career. One of the most famous victims was Dalton Trumbo. At the time, he was one of Hollywood's highest-paid screenwriters. When called before Congress, he refused to answer questions about his political beliefs and was sent to prison for contempt of Congress. After his release, he continued writing under pseudonyms and through frontwriters. The irony was extraordinary. 2 of his secret scripts, Roman Holiday and The Brave One, won Academy Awards while he remained officially unemployable. Hollywood was rewarding his work while pretending he didn't exist. Only in 1960, when Kirk Douglas and Otto Preminger publicly credited him for Spartacus and Exodus, did his name finally return to the screen. But political purges weren't the only weapon Hollywood possessed. The industry already had a legal mechanism for removing inconvenient people. It was called the Morality Clause. The origins of the clause trace back to 1921. That year, silent film superstar Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle became the center of a scandal involving rape and murder accusations. Although Arbuckle was ultimately acquitted, the public backlash terrified the studios. Universal responded by introducing one of the first modern morality clauses into performer contracts. The language was broad and powerful. Studios could terminate a contract if an actor engaged in behavior that might bring public hatred, contempt, ridicule, or embarrassment upon the industry. Other studios quickly copied the practice. By the 1950s, morality clauses had become standard, and they didn't require guilt. They only required bad publicity. In 1951, Joan Bennett's husband shot her agent over an alleged affair. Bennett herself committed no crime, and she was never charged with anything. Yet her career collapsed almost overnight. The headlines were enough. The studios simply walked away. They didn't need a conviction. They only needed a scandal, political suspicion, personal controversy, bad press. The system could punish all of them equally, but the blacklist and morality clauses were only one layer of control. Beneath them sat something even more powerful: the contracts themselves. During Hollywood's golden age, most stars worked under 7-year studio contracts. The arrangement looked glamorous from the outside. Inside, it was remarkably one-sided. Studios controlled which films actors appeared in. They controlled publicity. They controlled schedules. And if a performer refused a role, the studio could suspend them without pay. Worse, suspension time could be added to the end of the contract. The performer couldn't quit. The studio effectively owned their career. Many stars later described the system as a form of servitude. Judy Garland may be the most famous example. As a teenager at MGM, Garland was pushed through relentless filming schedules. To control her weight and energy levels, studio doctors prescribed amphetamines and barbiturates. Years later, Garland described a cycle in which she and Mickey Rooney were given stimulants to stay awake for days at a time, then sleeping pills to force them to rest. After only a few hours of sleep, the process began again. The routine followed her into adulthood. In 1969, Garland died of an accidental overdose at 47. Buster Keaton experienced a different kind of destruction. As an independent filmmaker, Keaton had complete creative freedom. When he signed with MGM in 1928, that freedom disappeared. The studio dictated projects, scripts, and creative decisions. Keaton later called the contract the worst mistake of his life. The loss of control contributed to depression and alcoholism that followed him for years. Clara became one of the defining stars of the 1920s. Then sound films arrived. The industry moved on. And the same studio system that built her simply left her behind. She retired in her 20s. Then there was Hattie McDaniel. In 1939, she became the first Black performer to win an Academy Award. Yet, segregation prevented her from attending the Atlanta premiere of Gone with the Wind. At the Oscars, she was seated separately from her white co-stars. Throughout her career, she was largely limited to servant roles and paid significantly less than the actors around her. When she died in 1952, her request to be buried in Hollywood Cemetery was denied because of her race. For some stars, the system controlled contracts. For others, it controlled opportunity itself. But Hollywood's most disturbing form of control came when it began treating human beings as products. Products that could be repaired, reshaped, or discarded. Frances Farmer arrived in Hollywood with enormous promise. Industry insiders predicted she would become one of the biggest stars of her generation. Instead, she became one of its most tragic stories. After refusing a role in 1942, her relationship with Paramount deteriorated. Following a drunk driving arrest, she was institutionalized and spent years undergoing insulin shock and electroshock treatments. Stories later emerged claiming she had received lobotomy. Those stories turned out to be fabricated. The truth was disturbing enough without them. Farmer lost years of her life to institutions and eventually disappeared from the Hollywood spotlight entirely. Montgomery Clift represented a different kind of erasure. He helped redefine what a Hollywood leading man could be. Handsome, sensitive, emotionally complex. Yet studio publicists spent years hiding his sexuality behind manufactured romances and carefully controlled publicity. Then came the car accident in 1956. After leaving a party at Elizabeth Taylor's home, Clift crashed into a telephone pole. The injuries devastated his face. Months of surgeries followed. But Hollywood had built his image around perfection. And perfection was suddenly gone. Crew members developed coded language to describe his condition. Georgia, Florida, and at the worst moments, Zanzibar. His acting teacher later called the years that followed the longest suicide in Hollywood history. Clift died at 45. Different stories, different victims, but the same pattern. A system that valued image over people. And when people no longer fit the image, they became disposable. The tragedy wasn't only personal, it was economic. By 1948, roughly 90 million Americans attended movies every week. A decade later, that number had fallen to 46 million. Television was rising, audiences were shrinking. The studio system was already under pressure. Yet instead of protecting talent, Hollywood repeatedly chose to destroy it. Internal MGM records from the 1956 to 1957 season showed 19 of 20 in-house productions losing money. The industry's old model was failing. And still, studios continued blacklisting writers, discarding performers, enforcing morality clauses, and controlling careers through restrictive contracts. It wasn't just cruel, it was irrational. The same studios that spent millions creating stars often spent millions more tearing them down. John Garfield, Dalton Trumbo, Judy Garland, Hattie McDaniel, Montgomery Clift. These aren't merely tragic stories from a distant era. They're reminders of what happens when institutions become more valuable than the people who create them. Hollywood sold dreams to the world. But behind the scenes, it often treated its own artists as disposable assets. The blacklist eventually ended. The studio contract system collapsed. And many of these injustices are now openly acknowledged. But for the people who lived through them, that recognition came too late. The machine moved on. They didn't. If you enjoyed this investigation into Hollywood's hidden history, subscribe for more deep dives into the people, systems, and decisions that shaped the modern world. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones Hollywood puts on screen. They're the ones it tried to erase.